You're good in the book? You're good online? Are we good? Excellent. Welcome, as always, to CyberScon Connect Volume 4, but it's actually our 19th meetup. Yeah, thank you to one person who happens to be speaking for us. Which is awesome, right? Like, I'm just amazed at how well these events go and how many people turn up to support us. Good to see new faces and old faces. Thank you. We'll do loads of thanks at the end, but to Will Mackenzie, to Product Forge, and the people that really put these together. These events don't run themselves, right? There's a lot of people involved. 15 minutes ago, we had a whole stack of tech issues to try and get these running, to try and get them running online. It's not without a bit of pain, so thank you to everybody involved who helps with those. Just some house rules, as always. So we started following the Berlin Code of Conduct recently, thanks to some feedback. We adjusted that, so please go and have a look at that. You know, I've never been informed of anything out of order in these events, but there is a code of conduct. If you're aware of anything that you're not happy with, please come and speak to any of us that are involved, and we'll do something about it. So just put that out there. You can help clean up. You know, this is put on by a great company who help us put on pizza and beers and things. So if you can put things in the bins provided and help with the chairs at the end, that'd be really appreciated. We're using Slido if you want Q&A, so slido.com on those little machines in your pocket, and use the code CSC4, and you can either send us abuse or you can send us some questions, and we'll try and do them at the end if we have time. If you have questions during the talks, I'm sure feel free to ask those. And that's it, really. So on to our first speakers, who are the beer farmers. If you haven't heard about the beer farmers, you're about to. So over to them.
All right. Let's get out of the way of the tally.
All right. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Edinburgh.
Okay. Hello,
Did I
Edinburgh.
say it right?
Oh, no.
Edinburgh.
There you go.
Edinburgh.
I'm Canadian, so I apologize.
Say Old Riki.
Old Ariki.
Okay. So we're up for sound. Yeah.
Yep, levels are good.
Hear us at the back. Not too distorted, because I have a habit of kissing the mic. Rock and roll. Alright, so we are the Beer Farmers. Thanks very much for coming along. Packed room. Awesome. Quite a few people I recognise that we've seen at some of the talks we've done this year. So thanks for sticking with us. But lots of new people we haven't seen before. We carry parental advisory, so just to get that out of the way up front. We do swear a bit. We're probably not going to say much of the word in the middle, parental advisory, tonight, simply because Andy Gill is not here. Okay, Andy Gill's a pen tester, a good friend of ours, but he swears.
He's a very rare type of Tourette's, which is only like one word.
But used as a punctuation. Okay. So we won't be saying that, but we will F-bomb a little bit because we get in the flow of things and we get a bit angry about stuff. Oh God, what happened? We are the Beer Farmers, and our talk is called Rage Against the Fun. Okay, Rage
As you can
Against.
see with the 6-point font.
It didn't start out like that, but what I do know happened is it came into contact with Harry's Mac. Okay.
So you're blaming Harry?
I'm blaming Apple. Alright, so we're going to talk about fear, uncertainty and doubt and the concepts in the context of organisations and people and press and governments that use FUD as a thing to scare you into behaving in a way you might not otherwise do. Okay, so we're going to look at that in some detail. A little bit about who we are. So the Beer Farmers are 6 people. It was originally started out by myself, Ian, Sean and John, who's over in Belgium. Doesn't spend a great deal of time in the UK because he hates the country.
Brexit.
And Brexit, right? Who can blame him? But I'm an InfoSec manager, team leader. I run a security analysis function at an ISP down south of the border, although I was born in Edinburgh. Ian, quick word about
Sure, right now I'm running cybersecurity for a giant financial company and enjoying every moment of it.
Can we ask for that again with feeling? Sure.
So I work at a security company. I used to be responsible for security and development. I'm just now changed roles and I'm doing security stuff. Still trying to figure out what I'm doing.
And we all used to be responsible generally, but yeah, time passes. That's our Twitter handle. We're quite busy on there. We've got a thing that we're going on with at the moment. Quick show of hands if you've heard of BC1.
Yeah. Excellent.
By the end of our session, you'll all have heard of BC1. And we've got a website which is
It is hackable.
hackable.
Yeah.
Right, so we've had a busy year, I think it's fair to say. We've spent a lot of time. Oh, it's pissing me off doing this. Stand in. Break the IT. Alright, we've had a busy year and we've been around the circuit quite a lot. We started off talking about companies that claim they take security seriously when actually they do quite the opposite. And that seemed to be quite a popular talk. And we CFP'd the hell out of the B-side circuit, I think it's fair to say. And happily, the B-side circuit said, yeah, we like the sound of what you're talking about, and we've had a bit of success going around the B-side circuit doing our talks. We did a spelling the B, so we got the Abate hoodies, thanks for that. Sorry, Abba's, keep doing that. We did B-sides Edinburgh, which was super cool. We got trolled by an FBI special agent, Ian and I. We tried to troll an FBI special agent the night before, in Brewdog.
Not the best move we've ever made.
It was a really shit
To be
move.
honest. Rocking up and saying, oh yeah, it's going to be an FBI briefing, they can't talk about anything and everything like that. Yeah. Well, he turned the tables on us.
He did, because he presented a slide at the very end of his talk in front of 450 people with us on it.
So lesson learned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't troll the FBI.
Don't
But
mess
actually,
with that.
Todd's a really, really good guy. He's the ALAT for the U.S. consulate and helps in like tracking down international criminals and counterterrorism. He's like a super cop. He's a really great guy.
And he's got a sense of humour,
Yeah.
which we underestimated. Okay. To our cost, but there you go. So we've been pretty busy. At probably June, we did B-Sides London, and that was a really good gig. But we decided we were probably starting to bore a few people with the content of our talks. So we sat down in our virtual world, and we came up with a new subject, which is what we're going to present to you today. So let's crack on. So a quick show of hands, who's familiar with these concepts? FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
You have a great future in marketing, all of the people with their arms up.
Now, to many, they're obviously words you all get, right? But they're used in the information security world in the singular or in a combination to get you to do something you wouldn't normally do. And an example of that could be a phishing email, using one or more of these concepts to get you into losing some money or handing your credentials over to a bad actor. But similarly, they could be used to get you to buy something, right, from a recognised vendor. Okay. So I think we all know what fear, uncertainty and doubt are as words, but we'll just skip through the definition. So that's the idea that you become emotionally aroused by the fear of harm to you or somebody you care about.
That is a picture of a person that was not a fan of our SteelCon presentation, I believe.
Correct.
Yeah.
But we're still here, right? Okay, uncertainty as well. Should I do that? Should I do that? Not sure if I do that. Well, I should have done that, then bad things might happen. Okay, taking the wrong route. But it's based on a stimulus, typically from an external party. And then doubts. Okay, excuse me. So, is something true, false? Am I being given some correct information by which to make a decision, or am I given some incorrect information by which to make a decision? And for those of you that have got any interest in biblical history, I don't, but I thought it was a cool picture. That's doubting Thomas. So Thomas was an apostle, amongst other apostles, and I'll put it out that other deities and books are out there. Take a bit. But the idea was that Thomas didn't believe that Jesus had arisen from the grave, and so what Jesus did was in front of the other apostles said, yeah, I'm a fish around in this stab wound I've got that the Roman soldier shanked me with a spear earlier in the day, and you'll see that I'm still here, I'm still alive, and that, if the word of the book is to be believed, was what overcome Thomas's doubt. Okay. Shout out. Anybody know what film that line is a dialogue from? Yes.
She's a sharp one. Thank God she's
Well,
talking.
you know what?
After
I've
us.
done this 3 times now, and I'm just standing there going, please say it.
Yeah.
Because what we want is, it's not in the film. It never gets said in the film, The Matrix or any other film. Okay, the popular understanding of this statement is that it's what Neo said, it's what Morpheus said to Neo when they were having the blue pill, red pill conversation. He didn't say it. But because people think that's what got said, it becomes part of the parlance, part of the belief, and the Mandela effect, I think is the term, that actually that quote was actually said in the film, and it isn't. But it's a perpetuated myth and a falsehood that then gets rested in people's heads, and they think it's true. The decision gets made on that basis. I'm not going to pick on you. I'm looking over there now. Okay. All right. So we've got some, because you're cleverer than me for a start, you know. We've got some incoming exhibits of what we're talking about. So if we really want to categorise what we're on about, it's people talking bullshit. And here's an example. Okay, Bloomberg, really big US news outlet. Okay, reporting on everything from current affairs, politics, health, beauty, food and drink, technology, and apparently infosec as well. Because it was earlier this year or back in last year, it was in the last 12 months, they claimed in an article that the motherboard manufacturer Supermicro was building and shipping motherboards around the planet with Chinese impregnated microprocessors that were somehow magicking data back to Beijing. Okay.
And I believe it was a chip the size of a grain of rice.
A grain of rice.
So for like 2 weeks, all I was doing was answering emails to vendors. Is it the size of a grain of rice? It was great troll.
Yeah.
Like some of the best. They've never actually retracted this story either.
No.
Which is really interesting to me.
Yeah. But it got jumped on very quickly by the information security community and the industry and other peers in the media, because it was rubbish. So we released a record on reflection of what Bloomberg had said, just to spin it into a slightly different context. There's a Chinaman in my computer, because that's effectively what this article was saying. It was that, you can't trust the Chinese, are sticking their technology in the technology that Apple, Intel, Microsoft, everybody, all the big hardware manufacturers in the US were apparently being victim of this particular piece of FUD, and it was rubbish. And Apple came out, actually, and said there is absolutely no evidence that we found that it's true.
That's right.
And that'll do for me, really, if Apple was saying that.
Yeah, because, like, to be honest, there was vulnerabilities in the baseboard processor, there's vulnerabilities in the UEFI BIOS, there was vulnerabilities in the operating system, and there was vulnerabilities in the actual network driver cards. But there was no chip from China in the Supermicro motherboards.
Yeah, absolutely right. Okay.
This is you.
I'll feed you the lines and give you stuff. Right. So Infosecurity magazine published this article that, according to some independent research that had been done, using a password manager is actually no safer than using a text file to store your credentials. Now that was a bit of a headline grab as far as I was concerned. It's also utter rubbish. Really serious weapons grade bollocks. So we did a bit of ranting and raving, and ultimately the article got its headline changed. And it went from using password managers is no more secure than a text file to flaws discovered in popular password managers. And the flaw that was discovered was that it was actually a Windows problem, in that Windows will cache your credentials unless you do something to prevent that from happening. So your credentials to anything you do using Windows are actually available to an attacker if they know what to do and you haven't done something to prevent it. It just so happens that if the operating system is caching browser credentials, then your password manager is at risk of being compromised, like every other website that you visit. The one thing that the browser will not cache, and neither will the operating system, is your unique key, if your password manager provides one. Which in the case of 1Password, just to pick one out of the air, is absolutely true. Now you can't see that URL at the bottom, but InfoSecurity didn't make a very good job of retracting the headline. The headline said that. When they changed the headline to that, they left the URL saying password managers no more secure -1, which was effectively the remnant, the fragment of the original headline.
And I just want to add, so in order to exploit the vulnerabilities that were found in password managers, the attacker would have to be in such a position that if they were in that position already, them compromising your passwords was probably the least of your worries.
Yeah.
So the attack complexity in order to exploit these vulnerabilities was so high, and the attacker could do a lot worse things, that in reality the vulnerabilities themselves, yes, there were vulnerabilities in password managers, we hold them to a higher level than typical software, but in reality it wasn't really a significant finding. So to then take that and say it's no more secure than a text file is completely wrong.
Bollocks.
Yeah, better way.
And I want to add something about the gaslighting that goes on in the industry on this one, especially with Project Zero. So there was, oh, you mean Tavis? Anyways, here's the deal. If you have local admin privileges on a box, yes, you can wreck it. So at 90 days, when you drop a security vulnerability, or 90+1 days, that is essentially, oh, I can break a certificate and it causes the box to not work, but a reboot fixes it. I'm not calling that like a parade day for security vulnerability, right? So there's a lot of stuff that goes on this. I have a conspiracy theory that a lot of this stuff is paid for, and it is created in order to throw somebody else under the bus. And all of these interesting Project Zero disclosures that have come out lately have been because Google and Microsoft and Amazon are in a huge battle for a $10 billion US government contract. So always look at this at the strategic level, rather than just, oh, there's another piece of software with a vulnerability. Gee, I wonder why we're talking about what essentially, for anyone technically inclined, is a non-issue.
Completely right. And an addendum to that really is to your point about seeing through the murk. The murk is social media, and the murk is the printed press. Right? You need to get under the skin of the actual facts to be able to understand the $10 billion project that these guys are after. But again, we're talking about FUD. Right, this is about multi-factor authentication.
Mm-hmm.
And Sean's good on this, so go on.
So I see time and time again how sometimes people say, hey, don't use multi-factor, you get locked out of your accounts. It's difficult to use, so on and so forth. But here's the reality is, people generally, well, we see time and time again that the same weak passwords are popping up, the same passwords are being used, credential stuffing relies on the fact that people use the same passwords across different services. There are also things that aren't in your control. So services get breached, there's weaknesses in their authentication. Having multi-factor adds another layer. It's just another hurdle that an attacker has to overcome. So putting it in place is certainly, from a security point of view, putting you in a better position. And trying to argue against that and saying, oh, it's going to make you worse off and that, sure, you may get locked out of your account, but guess what, an attacker may lock you out of your account when they breach your account. So it's really important that you try to apply an additional security measure. Now the other thing around MFA is around text-based. Personally, I would view this, probably generally the industry doesn't quite agree with this, but personally I feel we need to move away from that. Now you could say there's a bit of fear, uncertainty and doubt by saying that text is no longer a viable solution, but it's becoming a bit old. It's a technology that's been there for a while, there's known flaws, there's actually been known vulnerabilities with it. So the point I'm trying to make also around this is taking advice and applying it practically. So I see the same people advocating moving away from TLS, which we should, but then at the same time saying, oh, okay, well, guess what? SMS two-factor is okay. When there's been proven breaches with SMS two-factor, but none with TLS. So we've got to get the facts, we've got to assess the risk models and all of that to try and come up with the most appropriate solution for it.
Yeah, completely agree. And it's nuanced as well, because I was an advocate of SMS2FA up until recently, on the principle that something's better than nothing, and that was my argument.
It still stands.
It does, but Ofcom in the UK's lowered the bar. So a SIM swap attack, in my opinion, would need to require a level of determination in order to succeed. But Ofcom introduced the text-to-switch approach to make consumer life happy and easy in the UK and less secure, but they didn't consider that. So now it's theoretically a whole load easier to actually run a SIM swap attack on an individual. It was more difficult previously. So that's me changing my view around how I feel about SMS2FA. I'm not confident in its robustness anymore. And in actual fact, we don't know, but there is evidence to suggest, and we can argue about this outside, right, that Jack Dorsey's Twitter account the week before last was compromised because of a SIM swap attack. Yeah, and if he can't secure his account properly using really robust MFA, Authenticator, MFA, YubiKey, other things are available, then we're goosed. So that's what I'm going to say. Hey, are you alright with that, Nico?
Yeah, I don't think, I look at it kind of in a different way, and I think that MFA is actually a solution to a problem that is way earlier in the stack. So when you talk about security and you think from the attacker mindset, right? As soon as one IP address tries 4 different user account passwords and 4 different user accounts, that should be killed. We have all the telemetry at the load balancer if we're passing X headers, and all we need to do is suck that into Splunk and then tell the firewall not to accept connections from that IP address in China, that you have no customers in China that are trying multiple user accounts to get into your organization. I mean, what the fuck, right? So and then the brute force, right? Like, one IP address shouldn't get to try 7,000 SSH attempts to your network, because all of that shit is really noisy. If you have a SIM, even if you don't have a SIM, if you have somebody that can parse a log, you can see this attack, and you fire that IP address back to the network guys and say, listen, these guys have been hammering us for days, right? Trying to get in, right? Using the wrong cipher suite on the SSH. Why don't we just, here's an idea, stop them. So that's my rant on that.
Yeah, hell yeah. On China, by the way, other malevolent nation states are available.
Not exclusively reserved for
including our own.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
A laugh a minute, this one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Alright, so this is about the idea that a free certificate, the SSL, TLS certificate, can't possibly be secure unless you're paying lots of money for it. Okay? So the company that we like is Let's Encrypt. Okay, we've got a lot of admiration and respect for those guys because they're bringing certificates to the masses and not charging anybody anything for them.
And we get stickers. Trustify hasn't given me shit.
And seats on the board.
Yeah.
No, that's not true. Okay. But the more established certificate authorities, commercial certificate authorities, are kind of running out of ideas in how to make money. And so one idea is to tell you that a free cert can't possibly be as secure as one you paid for. Okay, all right. One is that, well, a domain validation certificate can't possibly be as secure as an extended validation certificate. So hands in the air, people cool with the concepts of what we're talking about? Yeah? I said hands in the air, not nothing else. Not too much. That's working in an audience tonight.
Nice job.
Beat the shit out of me afterwards.
We'll have a poll later in a survey. It'll be great.
Don't come there.
Ah, can't be. We haven't got enough time. It's because Ian's ranting.
EV's got EV. Green bar.
It's green, because people love green things. But Justify went on a campaign, right? That's why we picked these guys, because it was a 10-point campaign around why you should still keep paying for your certs, okay? Including, nothing cert related whatsoever, that the 380,000 BA customers that got breached, in one hand had BA bought their certificate, okay? Had nothing to do with it. It was a supply chain attack, right? So it's kind of bollocks, the whole thing. Free certs are equally as secure. Free certs are great because they have a maximum 3-month life cycle, so they auto-renew. There are tools and technologies out there Let's Encrypt provide, where revocation being bust might not cause you that much of a headache, because the worst case scenario was a 3-month certificate, or invalid 3-month certificate. Sure.
Yeah.
Anything on?
So, Let's Encrypt has become the world's largest CA, and this is pretty impressive considering that it's only been, what now, 3 years maybe? And it's not just because they're free. There were the likes of Komodo providing free certificates before. It's the fact that they've changed the model. They've simplified things tremendously with their ACME protocol. So ACME protocol is how you interact with Let's Encrypt to get the certificates. It's all automated, so you don't have to know anything about certificates. You just have to know how to run a command and you'll get the certificate. And the other important thing to keep in mind is there's a forum called the CA Browser Forum. This is basically the control around CAs. So CAs are the organizations responsible for issuing certificates, and their trust gets included in browsers. And they have to go through stringent audits, checks, processes to be trusted by those browsers. So if the likes of Let's Encrypt was not doing the correct job, they wouldn't be trusted by the likes of Chrome or Firefox. So that alone should indicate that a certificate from Let's Encrypt is as secure as a certificate from Trustify, because they go through the same processes, they're held to the same accounts. The only difference is one is free, you're not paying for, and the other one is you paying for it. And to those 10 points, I went through those 10 points and actually counter-argumented with them. Because I'm a firm believer, don't just say, oh, this is rubbish, show why it is not true. And I went through each 10 of those points and illustrated why they were wrong.
That you did. Okay. On the matter of extended validation, it's deleted its relevance. All the browser manufacturers have gotten rid of its importance. Because in Chrome now, Chrome 77, which shipped last week, you can't see the chip anymore that tells you the company name of the website unless you drill in. And you've got to do 2 clicks to see that PayPal.com is the actual registered owner of that certificate. Pointless. On mobile browsers, which many of us use above desktop browsers nowadays, you couldn't see it last year.
Yeah.
If a site operated an EV certificate, you were none the wiser, right? So it argued itself out of the marketplace, but not without a big fight from the CAs. I think the last point on it is, anybody know what certificate warranty is? No. Okay. Well, neither do the CAs, actually.
There is one thing I want to add on EV. So Scott Howell found thousands of EV certificates. Now, EV certificates are supposed to be held to a higher standard, extra validation, hence the name, so someone performing better validation on the request and that. Scott found that a whole bunch of these certificates were invalid because they contained incorrect information. He, as a result, got thousands of these certificates revoked. So that's showing that even though they're supposed to be held to a high account, these vendors are still not doing that.
Absolutely right. Okay. So apparently, according to vendors and people that know better than we do, the answer lies in the blockchain. Now, I've asked this question twice and got comedy answers. Does anybody really know what the blockchain's all about in the context of improving your security? And I'm serious, it's a serious question. Good, we're in the right room. Because no one does. In the World Cup, the Football World Cup last year, I was sat watching, kids were in the garden, I was watching it. Watching England beat Panama 5-1, but I'm in Scotland. Null and void, right? But anyway, at half time an advert came on the TV, and I think it was either Hewlett Packard or IBM. And they said, our state-of-the-art blockchain solution will keep you and your family secure. And I can't forget it, because it was in the middle of the World Cup on ITV, football match at like 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and I've got one of the world's largest technology companies telling me how something I don't understand is going to keep me and my family secure. And like my dad's 80 and he watched the same game and he rang me up and said, I've just seen this advert. What the fuck were they talking about? And I said, Dad, I can't tell you because I don't know. Oh, you're no fucking use, I'm not. So we don't know what it is, and bear in mind we're in Scotland now where people are a little cleverer. If nobody can explain it, then how can we solutionise with it to problems that we don't know it can solve? So that's really the challenge. But again, it's fun. So it's using a confusion about what a thing is to sell you a product that is not going to solve a problem you've yet identified.
And against actors that you don't even know about.
Yeah.
To give you another example of this, I mean, I was in the military, right? And I had military grade boots, and they sucked. So military grade encryption, if I have a frame of reference for that, it's not going to be that awesome.
Right? It goes to jams all the time, right?
So anyone got a mobile phone now? I assume most of you have. Your phone's got a military grade encryption, say yes.
Yeah.
Cobblers. Maybe it's next gen. So, AV vendors in the last 18 months have been using the term next gen to describe a current technology, which is signature-based scanning. But ours is different. Well, why is it different? Well, because, no, you use signature-based scanning, so it's no different. And then, oh no, but we use heuristics. Peel it back, it's signature-based scanning. Okay? Some are doing something a little cuter and cleverer and all that kind of stuff, but don't call it next gen. It's not next gen, it's just an iteration of what we currently have. Yeah?
So if you're Checkpoint, what you do is your marketing team creates a Wikipedia entry for 5th generation cyber threat, okay? Neglecting the fact that they're not sure what a 4th, a 3rd, a 2nd, or 1 is, right? So they create a Wikipedia page, and then they come out with this glossy advertising campaign, 5th generation cyber threat, you need our insert firewall product there. Well, if there's one person on the planet on Twitter that you don't want to go batshit crazy on you, it's Kevin Beaumont.
Yeah.
Grossly the dog, right? 130,000 followers. And he called them out for this shit. And Checkpoint, basically, I'm sure they spent probably at least 10 quid, maybe more, on this advertising 5th generation cyber threat thing, and they shut it all down. It occasionally bubbles up. I saw it on a pamphlet, and of course I took a picture to troll Kevin and said, yeah, they haven't gotten the message. So I took as many of them as I could, and I put them in the men's toilet.
Their final resting place.
Well, they were out of those little puck things, so I thought, you know.
So anyone heard about next gen blockchain? Yeah, that was at InfoSec.
Yeah,
in
yeah,
June.
it was.
Troy saw that.
Yeah,
Dark blockchain.
the famous dark blockchain,
Which came
suitable
from,
for the Tor network.
Came from one of them.
Yeah.
Along with John McAfee inventing cybersecurity. We did it, we got him in. Alright, so, and something else, AI and machine learning. So we are not yet in a world with a sentient computer, unfortunately, because it has to take its initial instruction from one of us. That kind of makes it a bit crap, because if we give it a bad decision to make, it's going to make a bad decision. And I wouldn't trust it to do that. You came on that point yourself, right?
Yeah, so I was in the most awkward panel of my life with the head of the chief of police of Dubai and a Saudi prince, and good thing I wasn't a journalist. Ooh, yeah. Ouch. Anyways, yeah, and they were talking about this, and I'm like, dudes, like, AI doesn't exist. You know, we have machine learning, we have pattern matching, but we don't have something that's going to come out, you know, of the computer and just start making decisions without, again, telemetry and inputs. We have algorithms, but we don't have self-awareness yet. And this is what marketing departments all over the place. What's that?
Apart from Skynet.
Yeah, apart from Skynet,
I've seen
right?
that
Yeah,
in documentaries.
absolutely, right? We have a serious problem on our hands when that shit goes down. But the point is that this is now been corrupted by marketing departments, and the actual scientists that are doing stuff in this area, like Dr. Jamie Graves, for instance, shout out to him and Zone Fox and all those cool guys. But the point being is that we're not there yet. We haven't done this. But according to marketing departments, you know, you're seeing this as, you know, leading the charge on it, and it ain't true.
Companies are making a hell of a lot of money out of it. Okay, 0 days. So we see a lot of this. We spend a lot of time on social media, probably too much time. But no one loves a 0 day more than the press, right?
The press has been going for this stuff like crazy, and again, you know, like when we're in the community, we really need it quantifiable. When we do the research, we find that it's a very limited attack surface. You know, there are some things though that we should freak out about. I think we were right to freak out about Blue Keep, right? Because we'd seen what happened when we just ignore SMB v1, right? And don't block one port at your firewall and get completely owned. NHS, I love you guys. But the point here is that you need to understand that not everything coming out is 0 day, and not everything presents like a existential threat to your business. Because here's what young cyber security people do, and I see this, is they come into the boardroom with their hair on fire going, oh my God, you know, the Chrome browser is, you know, completely open to compromise. And I'm like, okay, sure, like, calm down, take a breath, take a moment, and tell me, you know, about how this attack is going to happen. And they're like, well, you know, the bad guys can send us a phishing link. Okay, we have some protections for that, right? But then they can, and it's like, when you actually tease it out, it's about 10 things that need to happen, including the complete failure of your user awareness training program for those people and individuals, in order for these attacks to take place. But the press just says shit like, oh my God, it's the end of the world again because there's a 0 day. But Sean, you weigh into this because I think you have some important context on 0 day as well. Because vBulletin.
Yeah, so those who don't know, I'm pretty sure a lot of in the room know, but those who don't, vBulletin is a kind of forum type site, the software that's used by many sporting sites, forums, and a 0 day was dropped, I think it was yesterday or the day before, on full disclosure, 20 lines of code, remote code execution, bad stuff, no patch, but there's a patch now, but when it was dropped, obviously no patch for a while. So that kind of stuff is not helpful. If you have a 0 day, don't drop it, because I've seen a lot of people drop 0 days just to gain fame and glory. We won't get down there. So it's important that you work with vendors, get it fixed, because at the end of the day, the important part is not protecting the company, not getting yourself more fame and glory that will come. Protect the users. Protect the people who matter. And those are the users of the system that are going to be affected. So it doesn't help anyone just dropping 0 days. And then, as Ian said, think it through logically. Like the password manager stuff is a really good example. In reality, it was pretty much a non-issue. Yes, you could argue they should have been better, but in reality, what did it mean for your average user? Nothing. Certainly a lot better than using a text file.
I want to add just one more thing in terms of 0 days. Here's what you don't do. You don't publicly try to sell it to countries that are enemies of the country that perhaps will find you and vaporize you with a Hellfire missile. So I'm just saying, like, if you are going to drop 0 days, try to do it in a constructive manner that doesn't end with you and a pair of smoking boots.
Yeah, I like cheering up. Let's talk about governance. So, I had a thought on this, and the reason the slide's in is that the NSA dropped, well, it was Blue Keep, right? And you must patch. Windows needs dealing with quickly, and Microsoft followed suit with it. But it occurred to me that the NSA very rarely weighs in, or any intelligence community for that matter, weighs in on the patching and the 0 days and all that kind of stuff. Unless it affects them, and I think that's what we saw. This is just my speculation, conjecture, but that's what I felt at the time.
No, this is the duplicity of the government, right? On the one side, you've got these douchebags saying that we need backdoors and encryption, and on the other side, you've got an organization saying you got to patch because bad shit's going to happen to your infrastructure, right? So, you know, we can't look at the government, we look at it as a source of information, but they're not coming to help, okay?
No.
They have another agenda. And in a lot of these cases, they know that generally in North America or Five Eyes countries, your software is going to be licensed. So you're eligible for getting patches. In countries that, let's just say, they haven't exactly licensed their software.
China, okay?
Right. Actually, any of the current actors, right? China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, right? The licensing servers aren't even available from North Korea. You know that they're going to be in a permanently unpatched state. So you have nation states operating on the assumption that their protagonists' infrastructure will be vulnerable probably forever, but the home country's infrastructure is going to be safe. And that's what governments want. Governments do not want the internet to be encrypted unless they can control the encryption, right? So think again about what the motivations are, and you'll begin to see that there's this duplicity going on that makes it incredibly difficult for us as security professionals to be responsive to the threats, when sometimes the threat is the actual government itself.
Yeah, completely right. So I have my own take on FUD from a person responsible for defending an organisation and upkeeping its technology and ensuring that it's safe and secure, or at least as best we can. So I fear that I don't know what I don't know. Yeah, I'm uncertain about how many servers I've got outside there in my network. Yeah. Well, I've got a large IPv4 space, but I don't know what's in it. And the stuff I don't know, I doubt has been patched. So there you go, that's my problem. So 30 Linux machines that are kicking over there that have been built 15 years ago and are still in production state, that are vulnerable and I don't know about them. I care more about that than any 0 day, any cool trendy thing that Project Zero are dropping. Oh, it's interesting, but it's not the top of my agenda. And actually it shouldn't be for yours either. Generally speaking, it's the things that have been there kicking around for a long, long time that you need to have eyes on, and you can do something about it.
Attackers are going to go for the easiest targets.
Yeah, absolutely right. So we're nearly at the end, and we've only got a little bit more stuff to talk about. But if you look at these examples here, so these examples here, Equifax got popped because of Apache struts, an out-of-date version of Apache struts. Patches were available for Apache struts, they just weren't applied by Equifax. And we can talk about the politics of it all, the Equifax story, over a beer later. WannaCry was nothing to do with 0 days, it was about Windows supporting SMPv1 with port 445 outbound open to the internet. That's how the whole Eternal Blue double pulsar thing engineered itself across networks. And it took the NHS down. Out-of-date versions of Windows XP, which shouldn't be there at all. Again, we're getting a political debate about the NHS Digital and all that stuff. But these were the causes. Yeah, nothing cool, nothing negative 0 day or any of that stuff. It was all old-fashioned, out-of-date software.
I'm just going to give you a little preamble. There's going to be an article coming out where I'm quoted extensively on the NHS and the digital transformation. The issue that I have is if you make NHS trusts choose between doctors and nurses or IT equipment, what do you think you're going to get as an outcome, right?
Yeah.
So we are making the NHS trusts, we're putting them into an impossible decision. And NHS Digital needs to pick up the pace, okay? They were created 2 years ago now, and I have not seen a single thing delivered, right? I get that it's complex, but folks, we're talking about simple stuff. I get that the infrastructure that's patient-facing might be very difficult to deal with, but things like payroll and things like timekeeping don't necessarily need to even be inside the NHS's perimeter. And it frustrated me to hear about some great perimeter deal that the NHS signed for millions of quid, right? And no one told them that the perimeter is effectively dead and that most of your Employees are using their personal devices at work and doing patient-facing stuff on those devices. Like, the perimeter is over. The perimeter is 2015, guys. So this is what I'm frustrated with, is the fact that we're making these huge kinds of investments and they're putting the money in the wrong place. Where it should be is in identity and access management.
Yep, agreed. Shout out, name the game?
Waymaker.
Absolutely right. Loved it. Only played it on the Sega Mega Drive though, because that was the only platform that I liked. But in conclusion, really, and by the way, Apple, get Berlin Sans FB as a native font, right? Because it looks cool on a Windows machine, that font. Horrible on that. But yes. So we're talking about clickbait and ad revenue and things to attract you to click on an ad, ultimately. The vast majority of the large web presences are around advertising and generating revenue through that. The next gens, the AIs, the blockchains, all these kind of guys are all after you spending your money, probably on a solution that doesn't actually fit your problem at the end of the day. And when it's the NSA or GCHQ or China's state government or whatever, they're about kind of controlling your behaviour, right? That's pretty serious stuff, and that's what they're trying to do with that. But as I mentioned on the slide with the rickety knackered castle, you've probably got bigger problems closer to home. You just need to look a bit closer to home and find them, and probably improve your security posture.
Just want to mention one thing on the product sales. Who here has heard of Crown Sterling? Okay, a few of you. So, most don't. So Crown Sterling is a company that did a talk at Black Hat. It effectively, by my accounts, came like a marketing talk. They got caught out because they were making some bold statements. They subsequently tried to sue Black Hat because they were sponsored and expected to go unchallenged and whatever. I'll let everyone make up their own minds. But also recently, I think last week, they did a public demonstration of breaking a RSA asymmetric key, 256 bits, going, wow, we can break this key in 5 minutes, and then a 512-bit key done in about 5 hours. Wow, sounds impressive. Yeah, for probably 99. That key was deemed insecure in 99, so we're talking about 20 years ago. So again, re-emphasizing using crypto. I found a lot of companies using crypto because it's really hard, it's really difficult to understand. Trying to leverage that to sow this fear, uncertainty, and doubt, so you then do business with them.
And you know, it took a Brit to sort that out. Large Cardinal, shout out to him.
Yeah.
He was the one that did all the math and debunked it, and got it mentioned in Bruce Schneier's blog. So again, huge props to him for doing that.
Absolutely. All right, so that's us done. We're bang on time.
Are we?
Yeah, ish. So thanks for having us, and we hope you found it vaguely interesting and a bit entertaining. Thanks very much.
Thank you to the awesome beer funds. Now, next up, we have Laura. Laura's been a long time support of this event, so it's super to have her here. What you've got now for the rest of the event is a whole load of lawyers. So if you've done anything wrong and you need one, these are the people to speak with. But don't let that put you off, because their stuff is awesome.
Why don't you get wired up to? So I've been told I can speak for as long as I want. So yeah, I've been coming to these events for probably the last 3 years. I haven't been to any recently, so that last one was really instructive. I'm not technical. I am a lawyer, renowned for not having technical knowledge. I do know a little bit of stuff basically from coming and speaking to you guys. I'm interested in it, but don't ask me any technical questions, but ask me legal questions, because that's my thing. So I am a data protection lawyer, and I've entitled this data protection stuff because I use that as a technical term. I think it encompasses all the kind of nonsense that I have to talk about in terms of data protection. And because this is all about cybersecurity, I will focus on the security aspects of data protection law. And my good friends in the front row, who are also lawyers, are going to segue very nicely into what I've got to say today, as if we'd arranged it all. We didn't. I came dressed as a lawyer, kind of similar to what normal people would wear to a funeral, but this is what we do have to wear. Please don't be too concerned about that. I'm not going to be terribly serious. Yeah. So this is symbolic. It has become symbolic this week of everything that's cool about being a female lawyer. And I think we can all say thank you to Lady Hale, thank you, for publicising the spider symbol for keeping our democracy safe. So I thought I would use this picture just to explain what kind of lawyer I am. So data protection, yes, but I have a background as a criminal lawyer. So I started off life doing proper crime, and I used to go into police stations and prison and speak to proper criminals on a daily basis. I then turned to the dark side and started prosecuting criminals as well. So I was what is known in Scotland as a procurator fiscal, which is a fantastic Scottish term, but it means that I had lots and lots of power to prosecute bad criminals. Didn't have cybercrime back in those days, which is interesting. I think probably I did deal with the rather kind of hard end of cybercrime, which involves children and pornography. And we're not going to talk about that today, but I think you all probably know that that's what most of Police Scotland spend their time doing in the cybercrime unit, rather than the kind of stuff that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. I then moved out of the public sector and began working for, some would call it actually the real dark side, but went into a commercial law firm and then started working for clients who found themselves in trouble with the criminal justice system, but perhaps weren't the kind of criminals that I'd worked with before. So I have a Twitter handle which is Posh Crime Scot. And that's the way I liked to describe my practice when I moved into a more commercial side of dealing with crime in the criminal justice system. I then picked up a little bit of expertise in data protection law, and I'll tell you why in a minute. In fact, I'll do it now. So that illustrates the first big case that I dealt with in terms of data protection law. And I was brought in because I was a criminal lawyer and I knew the criminal justice system and I knew all about sentencing and how sentencing should work. So that's kind of what I want to focus on today, because it's, I think, something I can bring to the party, and I have practical experience of dealing with that in the context of the ICO issuing fines. So that's a topical issue, given we've already mentioned British Airways cyber attack and the announcement that the ICO made in the summer, and we'll get to that towards the end. So this picture, and I realise I'm standing in front of it, this picture illustrates the case that I dealt with, where the ICO had issued a fine to my client. My client was Scottish Borders Council, and they were fined £250,000 in relation to a data protection breach. And that data protection breach, it wasn't a cyber attack, but it illustrates how the ICO thinks about fining organisations, sentencing organisations when something goes wrong. So let me just describe what happened in relation to this. And there will be a bit of a theme here, because generally when something goes wrong, it's very, very silly. And that kind of is what happens to organisations. And that's what happened to Scottish Borders Council. So they had pension files, and they were all paper pension files of their employees and ex-employees. And they had a bit of a paper storage issue. So they decided they would use a third party to scan these pension files. That third party sent them CD-ROMs. It was quite some time ago. CD-ROMs with the pension files scanned onto them, so they could store them digitally, and they didn't have the storage problem with the paper. The third party then had those paper files. So what did he do with those paper files? One would think he would dispose of them securely. Maybe he did at one point when he started doing this work, but actually I suspect that at some point he was being charged to dispose of these files securely. So, thinking of perhaps the environment, he decided he would put them in the recycling bins in the local supermarket. And one Saturday, the recycling bins in the local supermarket were overflowing, and some of these pension files fell out into the car park of Scotmid in South Queensferry, and also Tesco's in South Queensferry, because he'd had to go to both because they were full. Awesome. So some worthy individual saw these pension files and thought, what on earth are they doing here? Took them to the police station, phoned my client over the weekend, and the panic ensued. What on earth are these paper files doing lying in the car park? And they get to the bottom of it and they discover that is what's happened. So some of them actually had to spend some time going to the recycling plants and checking where these files were, raking through the papers to find them, checking that some of them had been actually confidentially shredded. However, the problem was, how on earth did they get into this car park? The ICO were contacted. Now, back in the olden days, under the Data Protection Act 1998, you didn't have to report data breaches. Things have moved on from there, and under the GDPR you do. But back then you didn't. But most public sector organisations thought it was the right thing to do. So my client thought it was the right thing to do, contacted the ICO and thought they were getting some help from the ICO as to how to make things better, and therefore spewed forth all of the information about how they processed data, which wasn't terribly helpful when it came to the consequences for them, which was this £250,000 fine. Now, I know that doesn't sound a lot of money, but actually at that point it was the highest fine that had been imposed on a public sector body for a data breach. So it was a significant amount of money for a local authority. And we'll come to some of the comparable fines in relation to data breaches for private sector bodies. But at that point, the ICO really thought that public sector bodies, particularly local authorities, were rubbish at data protection, and said so quite openly in the media. However, my clients cooperate with the ICO, tell them all about what they've been up to, and tell them what the problem was. And the problem here was that this third party that they passed the data to, he's a data processor, if anyone knows these technical terms under the GDPR. He's a data processor. They didn't have a contract, a written contract with a data processor, therefore they breached what was then the 7th security principle. So that's the breach of the Act. And then the ICO have to prove that there could be substantial damage or substantial distress caused by that breach. They decided that there could be, and therefore they fined my client. So we weren't involved at that point, I have to say. They didn't contact the lawyers beforehand because they thought it was okay, because they thought the ICO was helping them. Then they were given this big fine, and it was only then that we got involved. So we argued basically that there was not a likelihood of anyone suffering damage or distress as a consequence of the breach. And that was why we were successful in overturning that fine. So it was, I think, possibly an argument that wouldn't succeed in a different context. Some would say it wouldn't succeed at all these days. But what the ICO said was, well, that is a blueprint. These pension files are a blueprint for perpetrating identity fraud. And the panel, that is a tribunal panel, said, is it? Is it really? And they said, yep. And they said, why? And the ICO said, because it is. And they couldn't really back that argument up. So they sent us away to get experts, and we actually got an expert who came back and said, well, actually, with that information, you couldn't, or it'd be pretty difficult to perpetrate identity fraud. It'd be pretty difficult to open a bank account. Lots of other checks and balances in place. Pretty difficult to do anything that's terribly distressing or damaging, and we won on that basis. Now, I think that was probably of its time and in the context. If the same kind of information went missing online as a consequence of a cyber attack, I think you could probably argue, or the ICO could probably validly argue, that that is more likely to lead to identity fraud and identity theft and be used. And I think we have seen that in some of the ways that the kind of personal data has been used. So I noticed recently, the last couple of days, Thomas Cook going out of business has resulted in telephone scams. The TalkTalk hack resulted in telephone scams. They didn't need a lot of information to cause that damage. However, we were quite happy because our client got their money back, and we are, to date, the only legal team in the UK to have successfully challenged an ICO fine. So yay for us, data protection rock stars. So that started off my career as a data protection lawyer, and I learned a lot really about how the ICO think, how they do their investigations, which is not terribly impressive, and then how they think about fining organisations and how they come to the conclusion about that. And I wrote quite a lot at the time, arguments about how actually this was much more akin to a criminal penalty than a civil penalty, and I'll not bore you with legal arguments. But effectively, the ICO had lulled my client into giving them lots of information without saying, actually, we're going to fine you lots of money. And I think it's very interesting in the context of the larger fines that are coming, which we'll talk about, to see how these kind of civil penalties work in practice, when actually the consequences for organisations are much, much more significant than the kind of smaller low-scale fines that the ICO has been used to imposing. And on that note, the next slide highlights some of those fines. Now, I did have little notes under my slide to remind me what the fines are, but they're not on the screen, so I'm going to guess and hope that they might be right. Round about the same time as Scottish Borders Council were fined for losing the pension files. There was about 3,000 files involved. Sony PlayStation had that big hack. Remember at Christmas, the PlayStation platform was hacked, and there were millions of people's data lost, and there were, I think, financial data, although it was encrypted. And kind of Sony should have been better at this than perhaps my little Scottish Borders Council, who may be constrained by the funding that it does or doesn't receive. Anyway, Sony was fined £250,000 for that one. So interesting, it was the same level of fine. Even more interesting, I think, is the next one there. So BPAS stands for the British Pregnancy Advice Service, and they are a charity providing advice. Now, there are some people who do not like the advice that they give. There are some people who are very anti-BPAS, and their website was hacked by one of these people who then threatened to publish some of the information of those who had used the service online. And it was, given the context of what they do, the data was sensitive, so potential for distress, which the ICO have to prove, was quite significant. But unfortunately, BPAS had relied on an IT provider to set up a database which had kind of not been updated. They changed their IT provider. Nobody really understood what was there. So it was a kind of misunderstanding, but they were responsible in the end for the breach. And they were fined £200,000 for that, and they are a charity. So similar to the public sector issues, I was pretty uncomfortable about them being fined roughly almost the same as Sony. Okay, and I don't think that's an unreasonable argument. We then get kind of further on in years. So TalkTalk, I'm not going to talk about what TalkTalk did, but they were fined a couple of times, and we all know that what they did or didn't do was pretty eye-watering. I think their fine was 400,000 or 300,000. Now, at this point, the maximum fine the ICO can impose is £500,000. So it's pretty low level, again, in the context of TalkTalk, in the context of what they do as an organisation. And I think we all know that I was listening to a podcast actually last week, and it was all about Dido Harding's news interviews after the event. It's pretty eye-watering, and you should go back and listen to it, because even now, 3-4 years later, pretty awful the information that she was given and the information that she then presented on the news. So I think initially they thought 4 million people's data, and it turned out to be more like 300,000 or 400,000 that had been compromised. However, they were fined. Carphone Warehouse, similar kind of thing. Uber, I think, is an interesting one. So they had an issue, and I'm not going to talk about the technicalities of the issue because you all know a lot more about that than me. But one of the things that interested me about that was there was an issue, it was identified, and they didn't tell anyone. They didn't tell the people who could actually have thought about what was happening and perhaps protected themselves from kind of the online fraud or the bank fraud or any of these issues that happened. And that was picked up in the fine and the way that the ICO issued that fine. 400,000, I'm going to guess, for Uber. Equifax, mentioned earlier, eye-watering, given what they do, eye-watering that they should have these vulnerabilities, but boom, they did. And I think, again, there was delay in terms of them advising the individuals. And again, under the old, in the olden days, that wasn't an obligation. Under the old Data Protection Act, no obligation to tell individuals. That has changed under the GDPR. So positive thing in terms of that. Now, the last picture up there is Facebook Cambridge Analytica. And you will all be aware that the ICO fined them. Now, this is not a cyber attack, so we don't need to talk about what happened or what is alleged to have happened in relation to Facebook sharing data with Cambridge Analytica and the consequences. So Facebook were fined the maximum at that point, and it was pretty uncomfortable for the ICO to issue that fine, because it was in the midst of the whole GDPR revelations and the big massive fines, and suddenly they're like, well, £500,000 for Facebook, let's fine them. That's the maximum they could have fined them. At that time, though, GDPR was in, but it was earlier. Some say that was part of the plan to expose the whole issue before the GDPR came in. Who knows if that is the case. So, maximum fine issued on Facebook. They are appealing that fine. They are appealing that fine, and I can guarantee that their legal fees will be much greater than the fine. Mine weren't for Scottish Borders Council, but theirs will be enormous in terms of the appeal that they are running. So there's been a decision already about that kind of procedural issues. What happened with Facebook, and this is kind of the thinking of the ICO is quite important, I think, for all of you to understand if you're dealing with breaches. But the ICO issued a notice of intent to fine Facebook. So before they got to the stage of fining, there was a lot of pressure on them to do something here. So they issued this notice of intent. We're going to fine Facebook. And they published quite a lot of detail about what their intention was. And then a good few months later, they published the fine on a completely different basis. So they'd said, here, it's Facebook, you did this. And then a few months later, no, you did this, but we're going to fine you the same amount. We're going to fine you the same amount. And there's a whole lot of procedural arguments going on between the lawyers and between Facebook about whether or not that was fair process. And these are really boring legal things. But it's very interesting to work out how the ICO issue these fines. They do their investigations. They ask for information. Usually the organisations will say, yeah, it's fine. It's fine. We want to cooperate. And cooperating sometimes helps to mitigate your fine. I wouldn't endorse that as a lawyer. However, what the ICO don't do is tell you what they're thinking until they issue that notice of intent. And this has been my experience now on several occasions. So the notice of intent comes through and the organisations go, what? What do you mean we did this? No, we've got this document that proves we didn't do that. We've got this evidence suggesting that that's not the right conclusion, ICO. And it's only at that point that you actually get to see what they're thinking and you get to submit evidence in relation to that. So it's a very backward and I would say unfair process, and that's exactly why Facebook is challenging the fine that's been imposed on them. There's other issues about whether or not actually anyone, or whether or not the ICO can prove anyone in the UK was impacted by the fine. And they don't need to prove that. They don't need to prove that. It's just the potential for people to be impacted. But all of this will be very, very interesting in terms of how the ICO are challenged in the way that they carry out their investigation. So one of the lawyers that's involved, the junior counsel that's involved in the Facebook appeal, was on the other unsuccessful side of the Scottish Borders Council appeal that I did. And so I fed him all these arguments, and basically I will be responsible for all the challenges that Facebook come up with without being paid for that. Is the way I like to think about it. That's not true. However, interesting one to watch. And so I think it'll be a number of months before it's actually argued. There's no dates yet for the appeal to take place. But in the context of the big fines that are coming, that one is going to be interesting just to work out how the ICO are functioning and dealing with investigations and the fines. Now, whilst I was preparing for this talk, I've been dealing with a Financial Conduct Authority case for another client, and I was raking about their website because that's what you have to do to work out what their powers are. And I came across this, and I hadn't been aware that Tesco Bank had been fined for that data breach that took place a number of years ago. So 2016, that's when it was, almost 3 years ago. And there may be people in this audience who have a lot of inside knowledge about what happened there, because I'm very aware that it was in Edinburgh, and I'm very aware that some people may have been actively involved. So I'm not going to talk about any of the specifics, but it's all laid out in the decision notice according to the FCA's interpretation of what went on. Now, the FCA works in quite a different way from the ICO. They have a memorandum of understanding. They have an agreement as to when the ICO will do the investigation, when the FCA will do the investigation. Sometimes they will both carry it out, and sometimes they will both fine the organisation. I don't think that's happened to date. But one of the very interesting things about the FCA is that they can issue much higher fines than the ICO have been able to up until the GDPR came in. So Tesco Bank received a fine in relation to that attack, was it an attack? Of £16.4 million. Quite different from 500,000. Quite a significant amount higher, and this is for something that happened before the GDPR came in. So it didn't involve personal data being disclosed, which I imagine is why the FCA took primacy here. Bad luck for Tesco Bank, because if it had been the ICO that had done the investigation, then the maximum fine would have been £500,000. However, you will see from that notice, and most of you will probably know what happened, but it is pretty eye-watering, and back to that word, pretty silly what went on. They tried to stop it, and they put some really fancy bit of programming in to stop it, and it didn't work. It didn't work, and people in Brazil were taking money. There's my technical analysis of what happened. However, what came out there was a much higher fine. One of the things that the FCA noticed was the Tesco Bank fully cooperated with the investigation. They put in place mitigation measures for the customers who were affected straight away, and they were praised for that, and I think that was really encouraging. But they're still hit with a £16.4 million fine. So where does that take us in terms of ICO fines? And you're you'll all be aware of the announcement that happened at the start of the summer. The ICO I think they kept all of their really important stuff till July, just before we were all going on holidays. I just remember thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to deal with all of this. Cookies guidance came out, data sharing guidance came out, and then these notice of intentions to fine came out. So these fines haven't been imposed yet, and that was FUD. A lot of the media came out with this. It was a fact they'd been fined. They're not being fined. So back to that Facebook case, the notice of intent to fine has been issued. So watch this space in terms of the eventual outcome, and it would be a terrible thing for the ICO to have to deal with if actually they end up not fining this amount or not fining at all. And I've dealt with cases where the notice of intent has come out and I've managed to persuade the ICO not to fine that organisation. Now, they hadn't publicised the notice of intent in quite the same way as they did here. So it would be a pretty difficult thing to pull back from. But in theory, given the way they carry out an investigation, that could happen. And BA, as you will know, said we are going to fight this all the way. So there you go. The fine that they're planning to impose is 183.39 million, which is a terribly weird number, but I'm sure they've got a really good technical way of working out why it is that figure. And that's where personal data of, they're saying 500,000 customers were compromised in this incident. One of the things, this is a wee bit geeky, but one of the things that's quite interesting about these fines under the GDPR, so not only are they higher, but because the GDPR is a European regulation, I'm not going to talk about Brexit, but because at this stage the ICO can consider all of the individuals who are affected within the EU when imposing that fine, that figure of 500,000 people being impacted probably applies to those in the EU. Under the old Act and under the new regime, when we possibly maybe leave at some point, maybe this year, maybe next year, who knows, the ICO will be limited to looking at those in the UK. So going back to the Facebook fine, that's one of the challenges that Facebook has made. So interesting in terms of how they impose their fines, because that is certainly one of the things that they consider when looking at levels of fines. So 500,000 customers in the UK, in the EU, whose data was compromised, and that's potentially leading to this fine. And then the Marriott fine, which for some reason isn't quite as high, and is also a really, really odd figure. We may or may not find out why they've come to that figure. However, there you go. It's very small on that screen. It wasn't when I drafted it. 99,200,396 pounds. Weird. For the breach. And again, this is they say 339 million guest records globally were impacted, but 30 million related to the residents of countries in the EEA. Actually, it's not even the EU, it's the EEA, and 7 million in relation to UK residents. Interesting that they've dissected all those figures already. Who knows? I suppose they might have anticipated we might have been out of Europe by that time, and that would have been a really good legal argument to have had with the ICO about what you could and couldn't do post-Brexit. So that is in relation to fines. So I would argue potentially criminal penalties on these organisations who are breaching the principles under the GDPR. And that's what the fines relate to. Interestingly, the ICO no longer have to prove substantial damage or substantial distress. So that test that we used in the Scottish Borders Council case doesn't exist under the GDPR. But that kind of thinking would influence the level of fine. Does everyone know about the Morrisons case? Some people don't. That's awesome, because I can get to tell the story. This is my favourite data protection story to date and probably ever. So we're moving away from the ICO, from the regulatory fines. What is important here is that individuals are suing Morrison's supermarket. So it's not a regulatory fine, it's a civil case, and they're suing the supermarket. Morrison's were not fined by the ICO. They investigated the breach here and said that actually they felt Morrison's had done all that they could to prevent it. However, 2,000 or 3,000 of the employees of Morrison's sued them for breaching their rights under the Data Protection Act. And to date, they have been successful in that civil case. So we're moving away from these fines, which up until now haven't been that high. They are going to be higher. And we're moving into much more of the territory that is faced in the United States when individuals who've been impacted by data breaches then sue. And that's where the real financial penalties lie. So let me tell you the background to the Morrison's breach, and this is the last thing I want to talk about, and you can go and have your break afterwards, but it is a good story. So this man here, look at him, master criminal on the right-hand side. His name is Andrew Skelton. He worked for Morrison Supermarket. He was quite a senior IT auditor, and during the course of his work, before we get to that, Mr. Skelton had a sideline. He had a sideline little business whereby he sold slimming drugs. And one day he got these slimming drugs delivered to the post room in Morrison's, wherever he worked, in a package, in a brown paper package, which tore a little bit, and some of the white powder fell out of that package. Police were called, the police came in, they test the slimming powder, which of course tests positive for amphetamines, because that's what's in slimming powder. Oh my goodness, where did this come from? People were arrested, not Mr. Skelton, bizarrely, but people were taken to the police station and investigated. And as a consequence, Mr. Skelton was disciplined by Morrison's. Now, it wasn't even that significant disciplinary action. It was just a rap on the fingers, don't do this again. But he was right pissed off at Morrison's doing that. So, in order to take revenge against Morrison's, he took the data of every single employee, names, addresses, salary information, and bank details, which he had legitimately because he'd been asked to pass it on to KPMG, their auditors who needed the information to carry out the audit. But he kept hold of this information, and he realised how he could exact his revenge on Morrison's. So he took it home, uploaded it to a public website. Seemingly he thought that would be enough, but it wasn't. He was very frustrated, so he phoned lots of media outlets and said, look how bad Morrison's are at data security. Look, they've just let all their data be seen on a website. And it became public, and he was eventually arrested. He tried to blame one of the other employees, and they were arrested. He bought a burner phone in the name of that other employee, so he went to quite a lot of effort to do this. He's a master criminal, doesn't he? He also tried to extort money from Morrison's. So he ended up in prison, and he got a 7-year prison sentence as a consequence of his exacting revenge, which seems to me slightly over the top, poor Mr. Skelton. However, Morrison's were then sued by 2,000 or 3,000 of their employees. And what the court said was, okay, Morrison's, you had all these obligations under the Data Protection Act, particularly in relation to security. And actually, you were all right there. You did okay. I think Dr. Jamie Graves would have something to say about that, actually, in the insider threat software that is available. However, the judge, being a lawyer and not very techie, said, actually, what you did was okay, but you are being held vicariously responsible for the actions of your employee, Mr. Skelton, so boom, you need to pay compensation. And that was the decision of the First Court and the Court of Appeal. So this case will be heard in the Supreme Court, yes, the lady with the spider brooch, in November. And it's going to be a very interesting decision. And effectively, for you guys out there, it concerns me because what the court is saying is, yeah, you can do all you want, but actually, if you've got a rogue employee who's intent on exacting revenge or whatever, causing you problems, then no matter what you do, if he decides he's going to take your data and upload it somewhere else, you are still responsible. And that's not a great message. It's not a great public policy message, and there have been quite strong arguments against that. And I'm hoping that the lady with the spider and her colleagues in the Supreme Court will look at the bigger picture here and not just simply apply kind of public policy laws which are used often in relation to public injury, personal injury cases. So there have been a number of cases where employees, and it is employees of supermarkets bizarrely, have assaulted individuals and the supermarkets are held liable there. And that's because they have insurance, public liability insurance, and every organisation has to have that. One of the issues that the judge alluded to in the Morrison's case was, well, you'll have insurance, Morrison's, so that'll be all right. Now, not every organisation has cyber insurance, whatever that is, however that is defined. And it's a very difficult sell, and it's a very difficult thing to convince organisations that they need. And actually, the best message is just be good at this security and make sure that people can't breach your defences. And so I don't think this is a great decision for you guys. It's a great one for the insurers, though, and they really like it. So, fines from the ICO, civil claims for breaches are going to be much, much more common. There's websites out there, you may have seen them, where law firms, not mine, are trying to encourage people to take claims against British Airways and Marriott, TalkTalk. So all these claims are sitting there in the background waiting on the outcome, I think, of this one. So that is all that I wanted to say today, and it's been super exciting to be here, dressed as a lawyer in front of you, very interesting people, so thanks very much.
We are going to have to take a break while our wonderful colleagues from Skyscanner get set up, so you're welcome to grab a beer or go to the toilet. I think it might be a good time for those that are staying to do some Q&A, but feel free to go and take a comfort break if you want to. Question, I'll pose this publicly. Do you think that GDPR has helped companies? Because I think companies have done a lot of work on GDPR, but whether their security posture is any better because of it, I'm not entirely convinced. I suppose it's probably more my own personal experience than...
And it will be. Yeah, I think... So one of the things that was missing were the fines. You know, and I think these big fines, and the ICO were terribly excited about them. They wanted to impose them, they wanted to say, before they came in, they were like, oh no, don't worry, we're not going to fine them high. We're not going to use our powers that much, and they realised they had to. And I think fines, once they are fines, will help. What I would like to see, though, is the ICO analysing more about why these fines are there, and not just kind of pointing to security, you know, kind of IT issues, but what are the big issues?
Yeah, when you talk there about Morrison's, you know, disgruntled employee, individual with quite a lot of access. If I think about the security teams I've worked for, we've all got a lot of access to things that, you know, rightly we should have to a certain extent. If I wanted to go rogue to a certain degree, I could cause a lot of damage, albeit the controls are actually quite well controlled from an organisational point of view, yet you've got somebody perhaps in my kind of position where I can do a lot of damage. So would the ICO turn around and say that the company had missed something there, or that it was actually we've done as much as we could, here's just an individual with as much access as they need to do their job, and they go rogue and they cause
Yeah, and they would, so if they see that someone has done as much as they could, and that's a good way of putting it, and an individual has gone rogue, I don't think they would impose a fine, but you are still going to face, depending on the outcome of this, civil claims. They will look at that individual in the context of Why did they go rogue? Was there anything that could have predicted that they were going to do that? So one of the things that the court looked at in relation to Mr. Skelton was, what he'd done and what he'd been disciplined for didn't relate to what he subsequently did. So it wasn't like he'd been flippant with IT or had any kind of pattern of doing anything with data. So that they couldn't have predicted that, and they did look at that seriously. They took that into account. Whereas if you have an employee who's made mistakes before, who's not paid attention to the training, who's not been disciplined for making data mistakes before, then that would be taken into account in terms of whether to punish the organisation. I mean, one of the simple things is, has the individual been trained? Now, in the security part of the business, yes, of course they have, but there will be other parts of the organisation where there won't have been any data protection training, or there might have been some online training, but actually in the context of what they're doing, they should have had more, and that's certainly something that the IC would look at in terms of whether or not it's been approached.
Question?
So just a quick question. So within that lawsuit, you have the directors, the executive directors of the organisation, also technically being victims of data breach, including all employees. So how would the court have considered prosecuting the company which is made up of their directors, which are also victims?
So that there's different kind of legal things going on here. So you can be prosecuted for criminal offences under the Data Protection Act, mainly as an individual. So he could have been prosecuted, well, he was prosecuted for various other things, but he was prosecuted under the Data Protection Act for doing something with data that he shouldn't have, he wasn't authorised to do. So that's quite a common criminal offence. Police officers quite often access the PNC to check out the new boyfriend of their ex-girl, then to see what they've been up to, and that sort of thing is prosecuted. And actually recently there's been even prosecutions where I think it was a social worker had emailed stuff to our house, to our home email address, unauthorised. So those criminal offences do exist. So under in the olden days, but also under the new Data Protection Act. Corporate offences are pretty limited so far. So the company itself, there's very limited offences like not paying their data protection fee, and there's this great corporate offence for directors, which is whether you're complicit effectively in a breach. It's never been tasted under the Data Protection Act. The sort of thing that under the Health and Safety at Work Act you might find directors being prosecuted for, but again, it's pretty rare. It's quite hard to prove that they knew or should have known or turned a blind eye, which would be the test. So criminal offences are limited. When the GDPR was being drafted, there was at one point a proposal to have directors being held accountable. And that's the bit that will eventually make the decision, and it will happen. It happens in health and safety. And I was working at that when there was this when the criminal liability for directors was brought in under the Health and Safety at Work Act. It was the bit that made people sit up, and they could go to jail if they turned a blind eye to some kind of health and safety issue that was happening and they didn't do anything about it. It's not here yet under this legislation, and therefore it doesn't exist. It will. Undoubtedly in the next 10 years it will come and that will make a difference. But it's not here yet. Does that help?
So, no. So my question is regarding the Supreme Court case. So first of all, Morrison's appealed twice, right?
They've had the initial decision, and then that
They
was
appealed
appealed, and the Court of Appeal very quickly agreed.
So we don't want a piece of that. So here's the problem that I see with this, and I honestly think that in the interest of everybody in law that they should settle the matter and it should never get to the Supreme Court. The reason for that is that should the decision come down against Morrison's, that would mean that we will now have to put in employee monitoring at an unprecedented level in organizations to detect the insider threat, quite possibly violating the UK's right to privacy in the workplace. Do you have some comments around that?
So the Morrison's decision won't say that in black and white, but I agree that that seems to be the logical conclusion. I spoke to the lawyers that are involved in this case, the barrister, it's the same barrister that's doing the Facebook appeal that's doing the Morrison's appeal. She's busy. She explained that it wasn't argued very well, and this is unfortunate. So again, it's a kind of symptom of lawyers not being very good at tech. Apart from these guys are really good at tech. So it wasn't argued very well by the organisation, the law firm that took the case. So they could have said, surely you must have known that this was happening. You should have known that this was happening, but he kind of didn't. I've not read it, but I understand that it wasn't particularly well played. And these are some of the arguments that should have been taken, but they weren't. So there's not going to be a precedent that says if you've got this, then you're all right. However, the outcome is going to be, if the Supreme Court doesn't overturn the decision, the outcome is going to be that companies may have to think a bit more carefully about this, or the alternative is that they're going to say, well, bugger that, there's nothing that we can do that's going to prevent this happening, so we'll just take out insurance. And that's not the right outcome, and I don't think that's the right public policy outcome, and that's what the judges have said that they were doing in lower courts, and perhaps it's unfortunate that it is a large organisation. Morrison's have never said whether they have insurance or not. They've been very careful about that. They do, but they've never actually said it, so it's not been part of the court case, but the judges have come to that conclusion. So there's a huge number of issues to be untangled in the Supreme Court, and the good thing about the Supreme Court, as we've witnessed this week, is that they're not scared to take really brave decisions, and they look a lot more closely and it's fantastic, the Supreme Court, not just because of that decision that they made, but as a UK institution, in America and Canada in particular, they have courts that look at really good public policy arguments, and they look at kind of policy documents that our courts would never have done, and the Supreme Court is falling into that category now. So I really do hope that they think about the public policy arguments, and perhaps you should go and speak to them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura, and for the questions.
I think we're using.
Yeah, you'll need handouts for the main system. Not only did Laura suggest that we had follow-on lawyers following on from the great stuff that she's done, also it's been the most interesting week in UK law for a long time, so it's almost like we planned it. How good is that?
It's every week.
Me and Harry need a bit of kudos for this, don't we? Anyway, over to wonderful Craig and a note from Skyscanner.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for having us. So if you haven't already heard enough about data breaches, we're going to talk about data breaches. So start off with who we are. I'm Anoop Joshi. I've been at Skyscanner for about 2 years now, focusing on privacy work, also intellectual property related work as well. We deal with privacy day in, day out. There's always some interesting privacy stuff going on at Skyscanner, and we're dealing with hundreds of millions of users as well. What we're going to look at today is really a framework for dealing with a breach. So where we've heard about the impact of if you have a personal data breach, what we want to look at today is you've got this alert or a notification, you think there's been a personal data breach. Well, what are you going to do about it? What's the framework in place? How are you going to deal with it? Because it's a time pressure situation. So I'll pass over to Craig, who'll give a little bit of his introduction and talk about the initial steps, and then I'll step back in.
Yeah, so I'm Craig, and as it says, we work on sort of privacy and IP issues over at Skyscanner, and obviously a big part of that is dealing with any data breaches that arise, not on a day-to-day basis, That's just sort of the false alarms that happen daily. But generally speaking, we will be taking charge and taking the lead on any large breach process or small breach process that would happen. And so the reason I guess we were asked along to speak here is a little bit to do with the nature of data breaches. There's a lot of value judgments going in to this process. I mean, what is a risk of harm to the rights and freedom of data subjects? You know, you don't just sort of pull out of a dictionary. You have to apply some value to that. But comfortingly, on top of that, there are some nice mandated procedures. You know, you sort of tick the boxes and follow the process. It's under intense time pressure as well, and there's also kind of not very much in the way of industry standards. You know, really there's not going to be industry standards in this, I don't think, until enough people have been fined that we can kind of learn from the example. I mean, so all in all, it's really good. You know, we really like dealing with data breaches. It's been great for the industry. And obviously what we do in the industry is get paid. And so we put together this sort of 4-step plan, which is going to set out what we think is a good approach to dealing with data breaches. And we've kind of broken this down into, you know, blocks of time. None of these well, actually half of these timescales are statutory in that, you know, when you become aware of the breach, there's obviously some value judgments in that as well. And the 72-hour deadline is very much sort of mandated, but the others are kind of just, you know, advisory, and we think they're quite useful. So I'll just take you through P just now, and that's plan the response. Now, planning the response in a response plan seems obvious, but there's a few steps here that can kind of catch you out maybe, or stop you having to go through the entire breach process in the first place. So let's just kind of touch on those. Well, has there actually been a breach? And sometimes you can be surprised by the answer to that. So for example, if you have systems that are compromised, but the attacker has brought those credentials to your system, you don't have them stored, you're not using them anyway really prior to that incident, then probably not a data breach because you've never really been in control or really ever been processing that data. Or another example would be when you have an intrusion on your network. You should really be doing all you can to determine whether personal data is at risk, but until a security breach puts personal data at risk of destruction, loss, and unauthorized access or alteration, you don't really have a timer that's ticking for you. And that's kind of an easy mistake to make, because what tends to happen when there's a data breach is it's very exciting, it's a bit of a nightmare as well, and you just want to go straight down there, straight in the rabbit hole, you know, bring in the CXOs, bring in everyone you can think of, alert the insurers straight away, and you tend to find that if it turns out really technically there wasn't a data breach, you can end up with egg on your face. So who do you need to bring in? We think that when you have the breach starting, you've got that kind of an initial planning phase. You want to have these people's numbers, you know, in your book. You don't necessarily want to bring everybody in straight away. Keep the culture of a data breach response, you know, consensus to bring other people in. So we kind of operate on a security, corporate comms, and legal basis, and then, you know, we add people into that mix. We don't start with the sort of the who's relevant, and then the sort of the Slack chain grows, you know, starts to reach the sort of triple figures. We try to avoid that wherever we can. But have the numbers somewhere, have a plan, and that way people don't think, well, I'd better run and tell the management, because you can say, no, there is a process for that. We will probably get there, and if we don't get there this time, we'll probably get there next time. And first of all, your priority should be, has the breach been neutralized? Now, this is obviously a balancing act, but any business, and maybe hopefully any person, would consider that the harm to data subjects is a top priority there. But the key is not to get distracted by that. There are things you need to know, and there are things you don't need to know, and the ICO has a list of things that it demands to know, and so balancing that is tricky. But we would say if you can't neutralize a threat, you know, if you don't have capacity, if you don't have the people there to actually help you out, focus on neutralizing the breach, because Anoop's going to touch on how you can do an interim report and kind of tell the ICO that, or you know, your regulator of choice, that you're not quite there yet with your investigation. So here's some things you need to know, and here's some things you don't need to know from experience. Well, you need to know the nature of the breach. You need to know where data subjects were from, for example. The number of records is actually not really that clearly defined. It sort of is. It depends on the specifics of the breach, but also the number of people who are affected by that, which is different from records, obviously. You know, the relevant contacts for the ICO to reach out and tell you how good a job you did dealing with the breach. And there's certain things you don't need to know, which is like who is behind the attack. You don't need to know that in the first 72 hours, unless it really helps you neutralize it. You don't need to know if anyone else out there, other businesses, how are they responding? What were they affected by this breach? Can we sue? That's a question I get asked. You know, whenever there is a breach, who can we sue? You know, can we sue the processor? Is it their fault? Is it? And the answer is potentially. But let's deal with that down the line, or you know, why it happens on a Friday. So the grand sort of summary is keep your eyes on the prize. Sadly, that is a report. But that's really what you're aiming for here. So in your first 72 hours, just be mindful of what is the ICO looking for and how can your investigation deliver that. And I believe on that, I'm going to hand over to Nip.
Thanks, Craig. That's great. So Craig set out quite clearly there, you know, what is the plan. And just a quick show of hands, actually. Who here has dealt with a personal data breach within their organisation? There's a few here. And are there others who have been in an organisation and they've just not had a personal data breach yet? They've got the plans in place and they know what they're doing? Okay. Okay, good. Well, that's good. I mean, the way we've broken this down, as Craig said, is you've got the 72-hour timescale in which you have to provide a response and know whether you're going to notify to the regulator or if you're going to be notifying affected data subjects as well. But breaking down that time period into the 24, 48 and 72 hours, it's really helpful to know what are the steps that you can be taking to stay in control. So Craig's talked through the plan, and now it's all about actioning the plan, which is start your investigation, identify the mitigation and remediation steps, understand how much data has been affected, what is the data that's been affected, is any of this sensitive personal information that's been affected, and keep that focus on the risk to the data subjects as well. Don't go down any rabbit holes, like Craig said, keep your eyes on the prize. And start drafting the report within the first 24 hours, which is a really key consideration because sometimes you can get stuck and bogged down in the investigation. You get near to that 72-hour period and you think, oh, we haven't completed all the heads in the report that are needed by the regulator. So important to begin drafting the report. So just breaking those down individually, you want to have an investigation team ready. So at Skyscanner, what we do is the security team owns that initial investigation. They've got access to all the relevant systems. They go out and they start to build a timeline of exactly what's happened. So when did the breach occur? When did we become aware of that breach? What mitigation or remediation steps have been put in place? And then by building up that timeline, we start to see the picture of exactly what's happened. And at this stage, within that first 24 hours, while we're investigating, we treat it as the type of breach that we will be notifying to the regulator and or the data subjects as well. And I'll just skip past this one because Craig's already really touched on that. But when it comes to the mitigation and remediation steps, of course, it's really important that you neutralize that breach as soon as possible, but try not to get bogged down in the future or additional fixes that you could be making. Don't start on those fixes today. Look at those after the 72-hour period when you start to look at the aftermath. But focus on neutralizing the threat as soon as possible. But as part of that, if you've got someone in your tech team who's working on fixing the breach or resolving the issue, you want to make sure you're clearly documenting the steps that are being taken as well. Because part of the report, if you're reporting to the regulator, is to set out exactly what steps you've taken to reduce the threat and mitigate the breach. So important to be on top of those actions. Now, in terms of the volume and sensitivity of data, again, Craig's kind of touched on this, but it's important to be able to define and understand how many data subjects have actually been impacted by the breach, how many records have been impacted as well, but also where are those data subjects. So you might have data subjects, as we saw with the BA breach earlier on, you had a number of data subjects who were in the EEA, but there were more data subjects outside of Europe as well. If you have data subjects who are outside of the EEA, you may have to look at notification in other jurisdictions as well. So you want to have a clear understanding and a clear handle on that information. And sort of linked to that is clarity on the categories of personal data as well. So if anyone has made an ICO breach notification, you'll have seen that there's a list of different categories of personal data that they would expect to see. So that might be health data, it might be basic personal identifiers. But when you're out there doing your investigation, you want to make sure that whoever is compiling that information has at the forefront, at top of mind, those categories of personal data. So you don't rock up at the end of the 48-hour period and realize, well, your categorization doesn't match what the regulator is expecting to see, and then you have to scramble around just to make sure you've got the right information in play. And then the final one is, are you processing sensitive personal information? Now, a lot of people might look at their service and say, well, that's not the type of data that we're actually collecting here. We're just getting usernames, and we're providing a simple basic service. But if you've had internal information that's been breached, employee-related information, your employee files, then you might have sensitive personal data within those as well. So important to be able to identify that information and pull that out and put that into your report within that first 24-hour period. And again, it's all about focusing on the risk to the data subjects. Now, when it comes to whether or not you'll be notifying to the regulator or the data subjects, there's really two elements to focus in. So first of all, if you're making a notification to the regulator, it's whether the breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of those data subjects. If there is a likelihood of a risk, then it's likely you will have to report to the regulator. And then on top of that, if you consider that that data breach is likely to result in a high risk of harm to those data subjects, then you also have to contact those data subjects themselves as well. And that's a really important point to be aware of early in the investigation and in the early stages, because you might have to start crafting those comms and correspondence as well. So that's the end of the first 24-hour period. You've started drafting your report. You've got people out there working on compiling the information and getting clarity. So that next 24-hour period, we want to start looking at iterating on that plan and the actions that you've put in place. So we would say, and invariably these breaches do happen on a Friday, so this is like Saturday morning, you're trying to get people in together to work out, well, where are we on this report? What additional information do we need to collect? We're working from the draft report. We're at this stage also establishing what is the likelihood of us having to notify to the regulator or to the data subjects, and begin looking at the PR strategies as well. Do you need to contact insurers or any third parties? We mentioned insurance earlier on today. And at this stage, within the 48-hour period, you want to be pretty clear on whether or not you're actually going to meet that deadline as well. If it's looking like it's unlikely you'll have all the information to provide the report, then you maybe want to start looking at whether or not you file an interim report. So just quickly stepping through each of these stages. Share the draft report internally with your team, but you might have external lawyers that you want to get some input from, your Chief Information Security Officer, if they've not already been looped in, Data Protection Officer as well. Start to identify any gaps in the information within that 48-hour period, and be clear on who's going to complete those gaps. And if it looks like it's quite obvious that you're not going to be in a position to provide that information, then the question really is, do you want to start looking at filing that interim report and identifying the steps that you need to take to file a final report with the regulator. And at this stage, you should be pretty clear on whether or not you're going to have to notify to the regulator. And that means making that assessment as to the risk or the consequences to the data subjects who are affected by a breach, being clear, having analysed, having all the information about who the affected data subjects are, which regulator you will be reporting to. For most of us in here, it's going to be the ICO, but even for a company like ours, where we have data subjects here all over the world, we might have other jurisdictions where we have to report as well. And have clarity at this stage as to whether or not you're going to be actually sending a notification to those affected data subjects saying there has been a breach, and what is that message going to look like. And on that front, really important to start pulling in together your PR folks as well, and starting to look and work on that strategy. If you're going to be advising the affected data subjects, you want to be looking at crisis communications being drafted and ready. Your report should be at an advanced stage, so you know what's happened, when it happened, what mitigation steps have been put in place. How are you going to frame this publicly as well in terms of a response? The information is going to be out there. People are going to start asking questions as well. So are your customer service teams briefed? Your social media teams as well? Is your exec team briefed, especially if it's an internal employee-related breach? There'll be questions internally as well that are going around. So really important to get on top of this. And this is all happening within the first sort of 48 to 72 hours of which you've become aware of this breach. So there's lots of spinning plates to be aware of. And if you haven't already, start looking at contacting your insurers. Do you have cybercrime related insurance? And if you don't, maybe start looking at that as part of some follow-up actions. So you're almost there, end of the 48-hour period, into the last 24, time to deliver. At this stage, you want to be in a position to finalise your report, or at this stage, be filing your interim report with the regulator to say, here's where we are, here's the issue, and there's further investigations that need to be carried out, and we'll carry those out and provide the timescales. And then begin looking at your retrospective or your aftermath. Now, in terms of finalising the report, I mean, at this stage, all the gaps in the information should be filled. If there's anything additional, you should identify that. But a word of warning, and I don't know if anyone has had to really deal with the ICO's form and have been using it on a Mac, but it's full of macros and it just doesn't work. So we've been in situations, I've personally been in a situation where I've had a few hours left to submit a notification and I just couldn't get it to work on my computer at all. It was really stressful. It was a horrible experience to go through. So if you're having to do this, get access to a Windows machine or get someone else to actually fill in that information for you. And once you're at that stage, really, the question is, are you sending in that notification to the regulator? So if you send a breach notification to the ICO, you'll get an automated response, you'll get a case number, and they might follow up, they might not. We've had one-liner email responses from them. We've had nothing from them in the past as well. They are fairly inundated with the number of breaches that have been reported. So, they have their own agenda in terms of how they're dealing with these things. But you've done your bit at this point. It's the end of the 72-hour period. And if you're notifying the data subjects, you want to be clear on the messaging that you're sending to those data subjects, but also having a team internally lined up and ready to actually provide responses, because people will have questions and people will follow up on that. Now I'm going to pass back to Craig. So at the end of the 72-hour period, what do we do next?
Just on that point about the Macs, was it the CMA, was it, that asked you to delete or thought you'd forgotten to attach
that was a different thing. Yeah, that was the CMA, yeah.
Asked you to delete the folder, the Mac OS folder that comes in the attachment, anyway. So, here we go.
We're technically minded.
This is the last slide. What do you do afterwards? Because this is going to, if it's happened once, it's going to happen again. And if it's not happened before, you just didn't spot it when it happened the first time. So you want to do a retrospective. Get a team together, sit down, talk about what was rubbish about the process and what was good about the process and how you can fix that. Big question you can ask is, are our data records useful? I mean, you've got this huge exercise that you've got to do under GDPR. You've got to have a record of every single kind of piece of information, every processing activity that's sort of coming through. Was that useful, and why not? Because there's lots of ways you can cut that, you can do it in various ways, they provide templates, but if it's not working for your business and it's just working for the regulator, have a look at what you can do to that to make it useful. Were you lacking any advisors? Did you have any questions you didn't know the answer to? The usual stuff after something's gone wrong. The only difference here is you want to really save your working and make sure you update your breach register, because sometimes it's, for the next one, it's nice to start from the one you filled in last time. Okay, well, thanks everybody. It's Greg from the Skyscanner. Cheers now.
Thank you.
Advice is there, just learn your breach after breach after breach. Right, so look, we don't really have any time for Q&A, I'm afraid. My screen's gone blank. I have some thank yous as always to our speakers. Thank you so much for the time committed and the content. There's been 19 events we've done, which is like 60 odd speakers, and everything that we've had in these events has been phenomenal. Thank you to Woodmac for putting on the venue and the beer and the pizza and everything else. There's a lot of effort that goes into it. To Product Forge for streaming, and to everybody for coming, right? These events are only successful because you come along to them. We're always looking for speakers, we're looking for helpers, so please get involved if you want to help out. We're going to go to Brewdog, I think, to network, beers, coffees, whatever you want. Am I missing anything, Harry? Oh, Digit Expo in November. We are hosting a panel on mental health and burnout. So not necessarily cybersecurity, but we have a professor of something.
Memory.
So somebody cleverer than me. Somebody who works in HR that is a mental health advisor, a CISO who has dealt with burnout, and others on a panel to talk about mental health in our industry. I think it's going to be really, really good. So please come along to that. It's a free event.
Can I mention one thing quickly?
Yes.
Alright. So the beer farmers are hosting a virtual conference called the BeerCon 1. It's going to be 12 hours, December the 7th. The purpose of this, just get a retrospective from different people across the industry, and we're trying to raise funds for both EFF, privacy-based charity, and mental health hackers. I think I got the name right. So all money for that's going to those two charities. Details on our website will come to you first. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, please support that. Just before we go, and love to carry on the conversation in Brewdog. If you can help tidy up, it would be really, really awesome. If you can help put the chairs, we can try stacking in the back there, and help Jordan and the team, it would be really, really helpful before we go somewhere else. Thank you as always. We'll see you again in November. Yeah, can't say much more. Thank you.